You are listening to Survival Stories with Jacqui. Welcome, survival warriors. If you are a victim or survivor of trauma, then you're in the right place. In this show, we'll explore the extreme strength displayed by victims of trauma as they journey through life to the survival pinnacle. My name is Jacqui, and I am so grateful to be here today to share my survival with you. Here is this survival story. Let's dig deep. Hi, my name is Jacqui Gold. Welcome to Survival Stories with Jacqui and Friends. At the time of experiencing a traumatic event, it's difficult, isn't it, to really appreciate the effects that it will have on your whole life. At the time that it happens, we just see it in the moment. But as we get older, we experience the after effects. Experience has shown me that evidence of survival is often not easy to be seen for survivors because in themselves, they develop low self-esteem and have to build their way out of that. And sometimes it seems so difficult. But since sharing my own story, I found a healing, a peace in knowing that I'm helping others. And that is why I've invited friends of mine to come on and tell their stories. Every survivor is a friend. I'm Jacqui, and this is Survival Stories with Jacqui and Friends. Right, I'd like to introduce you to Dan McPherson. Dan is a highly successful broadcaster, entrepreneur, leader. I could continue forever with my descriptions of Dan. But instead, I'm going to hand you over to him to let him tell you what he does today. Please welcome Dan McPherson and give him some love.
Hi, Jacqui. I'm so thankful to be here, and I'm thankful that you are taking an opportunity to share these stories. I think these stories matter so much, and one of the key messages of my life is that there is light through the darkness. I've spent, as I'm sure we'll get well into, a good amount of my life struggling with the darkness and feeling lost in it in many cases, and I'm so thankful to be in the spot that I am now.
Oh, that's great to hear. And we're very thankful that you're in the spot you are today as well, because as, excuse me, as we don't know yet, I know, but my viewers don't know, and I'm excited for you all to know, Dan does an awful lot of good things in the world, which has come from his healing and has come from his looking upwards and forwards. And I just need to stop talking now, I know, so that you can hear it from Dan.
I can listen to you talk forever, and I'm excited about that. But sharing just a little of what I'm doing now. Right now, I run a company called Leaders Must Lead, and our mission is to significantly and positively impact the lives of 1 million creatives and entrepreneurs, to equip them with the foundations of success that they need to achieve their dreams, and to, as a result, inspire generational change in the world that'll reduce the larger problems we face, such as human trafficking and hunger and poverty. I also am beginning a foundation called Light from Darkness to help reduce the issues of suicide, particularly with teens around the world. And I'm fortunate to speak internationally. Last year, I was excited to be able to speak throughout Southeast Asia and in 8 countries. And this year, before COVID happened, we were aiming at 12. So that'll just move to next year now. And I have an opportunity to engage with incredible people in my life to coach, to train, to teach, and to learn from. The network of people that I'm around is unbelievable. I passionately believe that people matter most and relationships are foundational to everything. And that is a lot of what I focus on. So those are some of the things that we're doing in the world. Plus, oh wait, the Dreams Are Real podcast, where we share that no matter where you are, no matter who you are, your story matters and your dreams truly are real.
Oh, that's just fantastic. Well, you know, I'm a big fan. I'm a huge fan, and that isn't easy to achieve with Jacqui Gold, I'm afraid. But
And I'm excited to have gotten that done. I'm honored by it, truly.
right, Dan, you're doing so much good in the world, but I know there was a time where you couldn't see your way forward. What I'd like you to ask you to do, if it's okay with you, is to take us there. Take us to that point. Excuse me, everybody, I've got a terrible frog. Take us to that point, Dan, where you would say you were at your deepest, darkest moment and you couldn't see your way forward.
There have been several of those moments in my life, and I think there are a number of those moments that most people face. For me, it's compounded by the fact that I have struggled with anxiety and depression for a lot of my life. I remember as a kid being afraid of a lot of different things. I think it would be helpful, as we'll probably touch on a few of those dark moments of my life, to give just a little bit of an outline of, we'll call it my early years, I guess. When I was younger, when I was very young, from the ages of 2 to 8, I was hidden from my father. And I should note that I have clear memories back to 6 months old. So everything from 6 months old until now, I can picture, I can talk about, I can think about, and that's a double-edged sword. There's good moments, and there's certainly pain associated with that. But from 2 to 8, I was hidden from my father. When we came back to town, my mother had taken me away protectively, and she brought us back. We lived in pretty extreme poverty. I remember we had half a hot dog in the house and we didn't have anything else. And she would come up to me and say, "Hey, here's what's for dinner." And I would eat my half a hot dog and ask her, "Well, what else is there?" And she said, "Oh, you've had enough, and go play." And like most kids, I didn't really know what was going on and the heartbreak she was probably feeling with that. I learned later that at that time she was actually selling herself so that we could have a place to stay. And I was being bullied every day, but I thought all of that was normal. I then I then just continued forward and tried to make friends and tried to forge my way. I've found myself to be pretty resilient over the years. It's the number three strength that I claim in life. And as she got remarried, I was then exposed through the rest of my new family to violence, to drugs, to murder, to so many other crazy things. And by the time I was 16, I felt, as I think a lot of teenagers do, I felt hopeless and I felt overlooked. I felt unprepared for what was to come, whatever that may be. Even though I also had this dueling thought that I was meant to do something, but I got to a spot where I just didn't feel like I could even go on, and I survived my first suicide attempt at that point. And I'm glad to dig into there in a moment and look at that or look earlier. But I think it's worth noting that I then, coming out of that, and note that I said first suicide attempt, so unfortunately not last. I've had my last. I will never be there again, but it was 11 years ago that I had another. The lesson I took from that first attempt was that your environment, the places that you are, the people that you're around, that it exerts influence, but it's our choices that really create change. And I started making choices that would get me out, and I moved forward, and I ended up on a path of 25 years of crazy escalating success and failure and the rides and bumps and roller coasters. But I that's where I ended up going. So we can dig into anywhere there, but I would say this, that throughout my life, I have fought the darkness. Throughout my life, I have fought the pain. I fought the feelings of insecurity and hopelessness and struggle. And I've felt truly lost in it at any number of points. And really the underlying lesson is that we lose perspective in the middle of it, but there is always light through that darkness.
Dan, let me ask you that something. I'd like to go a little deeper
Mm-hmm.
on your first suicide attempt.
Yes.
Can you remember what happened that day?
Yes.
Take you to that point.
Sure. I was 16. I I had been going through all the things that I talked about. I had been inserted into this new family, although it was years before that. I had dealt with brothers and sisters who were struggling with the law. I had been exposed to so many different things, so many people doing drugs. I never actually really did them other than when I was held down and forced to. uh, I was on the other half of my family, so I was involved with split custody, and on the other half of my family I would go and be able to play with friends, and I would play role-playing games with them, which I still play to this day. They were foundational in shaping how I think, and really they were a part of what saved me at longer term. And I had that as an escape. I played with different toys and things like that. And then I would come home, and I loved my mother. She was the person I was closest to on the planet. But other than that, the environment was pretty rough. And there were the normal things where I would have chores and stuff like that. But I would also have situations where if I did something that was out of line, and I was always different. I was always the kid who did not fit in, who wanted to read rather than work on cars, and wanted to play video games rather than mow the lawn, which is, that part's pretty normal, but I took it maybe a little bit further, of being pretty obstinate. And I'd gotten to a spot where I just felt, I would say it wasn't sad. Most people think that depression means sad. And sad is often a lead in, but sad isn't really, in my experience and in the experience of most of those I deal with, isn't really the hallmark of true depression. Apathy is, grayness is, seeing things that are washed out really is. And that's what erodes your hope, because you get to a spot where you no longer really feel it. You no longer really care. You feel lost in. I think of the movie The Never Ending Story. You feel lost in the darkness. There, you feel lost in as it just disappears. And I'd gotten to that spot. I'd gotten to the spot where I felt really, truly, just hopeless, and I didn't have access to a gun or anything like that. And I look back, and I'm thankful, because in my life, when I've had access to easy things, I can make difficult decisions and step through them. And that's a decision that day I felt very confident was the right one. I'll also say this, that my later attempt 11 years ago now was a much more committed, believing it was the right thing attempt. This was more, I think, where a lot of teens struggle with not knowing where they fit, with feeling unprepared, with feeling lost, with feeling hopeless, but still having that underlying piece that it wasn't really truly what I wanted to do. It was just that I didn't know what else to do.
Absolutely, yeah. That is a common thing through the teens. Some of, more common than we would have or
Right.
want to believe.
Well, and it was also that, man, I'm in pain every day.
Yeah.
I'm struggling every day. And while I may have grayness of emotion, I've got like the pain of life and not fitting in and being bullied and being shoved around and all of this stuff. And with that, I was looking at it as an escape. And I think as teens, because we have such a limited experience of life, where we think we have all the experience of life, that I thought I knew pretty much everything, and I thought I was the smartest person in the room. Now I realize my goal is to actually be like the least smart person in the room. And I'm fortunate to have incredible people in the world and have that opportunity. But I was in, I think, that space. And it's good that I wasn't as committed to it as I could have been. Like, I was well beyond just thinking about it. I was well beyond having it as an idea, but I wasn't in I've done it. I looked for the easiest opportunity. I had more taken time to plan. I was going to go and step in front of a train, and there was a train near my house. And my second suicide attempt involves a train as well, just in a different way. And I was going to do that. And I was just in a bad way. And even for me, I was more off than normal. And thankfully, a friend of mine who I'm connected to this day, she saw that something was more off than normal. She saw that I was a little off. And I know there's a resonance with your story in that as well.
Mm-hmm.
But she, who was someone that I cared greatly about, who in another world may not have engaged with me a lot, but in this world demonstrated care and said, "Hey, I'm going to take you somewhere," and went and sat and talked with me. And that moment, that intercession that might not have happened in another situation, that might not have happened from another person, her seeing that moment stopped everything. That moment gave me I think it's like when you're climbing a mountain, right? When we're climbing a mountain, we get tired. And we have one hand, maybe it's just our fingertips that are on, and we start thinking, if I just let go, it'll be okay.
And I want to
go ahead.
Right there, before you continue, I want to stop you. And while we think about you on top of that mountain and what happens next.
Welcome to the Dreams Are Real podcast, where we aim to ignite the fire that allows you to unleash your greatest potential. I'm your host, Dan McPherson, and I'm on a mission to help you own your story on the way to building your ideal life.
Okay, thank you, Dan. So, a really, really awful stream of events took you to this point where you were at the top of the mountain and you were tired and you were in a dark place. And this young lady came along and helped you through. Could you go into that process for me, how she helped you through, how you felt coming through that point, and how your life developed after that point?
Of course. Well, as I was describing with the mountain, I think that's a good analogy. I think we all get to the spot where we feel like we're just hanging there and it'd be easier to let go. And that's really where that attempt was for me, is that I felt like that was just the easiest solution. I felt like probably no one would care. And I recognize now that was an incredibly narrow view, that's not at all the case, that others, it would have been a huge impact. I had known of others at that point who had committed suicide earlier. It was in middle school that I was first exposed to losing someone that I knew. And since then I've lost more than 100 people that I know. And I felt unnoticed, unimportant, uncared for, bullied, lost. So when she asked me how I was doing, and when she didn't accept the deflecting answer, which of course, as with most people, is "I'm fine." Right? "I'm fine" is such a shield. "I'm fine" is such a defense that we use. It's such just a courtesy.
Absolutely, yeah.
And she didn't accept that. And she said, "No, really, how are you doing? What's going on? It doesn't seem okay." And she took the time to sincerely ask. And in fact, that was something that started a pattern for me, that when I talk to people, I don't ask how they're doing and not mean it. Ever.
Absolutely. Yeah, I understand that point completely. it's one of those that how you're doing, where you can expect people to say, I'm fine, but it doesn't actually mean anything by itself. You have to actually realize how that person's feeling in the moment.
When I train communication, one of the things that I share is that the truth is typically 4 to 5 whys deep, or 4 to 5 questions deep, but we typically only ask 2 to 3. So if we take the opportunity to sincerely mean it when we ask those questions, it changes people's lives. It changed mine. And when she saw that I wasn't okay, when she was able to get enough out of me, and it wasn't the easiest to share because I was pretty locked up. I was in a bad place. She said, let's go and talk. She said, I'm going to give you a ride home. And what I didn't really realize that meant is she was going to drive me somewhere and we were going to sit and talk for a while. And that we talked about a lot of things, and some of it was very light. Some of it was, I can tell you now, and I've had this conversation with her, that it wasn't super strategic. Like now, if I beat someone in that situation, I may have strategy in my mind. I may understand some of the triggers and some of what's going on. At that point, we were teenagers. She was younger than I was. We were really, and I guess that's a good point to make, is she was 2 years younger than me, and we were in high school. We're not you don't know the impact that you can have by simply caring. And it doesn't matter what age you are. It doesn't matter what your situation is. Just care about people, because her caring that day in that moment saved my life.
Absolutely.
And I had an opportunity to have a similar conversation with her many years later. And I won't, out of respect for her, I won't go into details of that, but I can tell you that you never know what's going to happen in the world, and you never know where that connection will lead.
Absolutely. I can imagine that in the moment, she didn't realize the power of her words and the impact that it would have on your life. And that the power you can see through the fact that you were able to talk to her a few years later and she remembered it.
20 years later, I reminded her of that situation, and she, to that point, hadn't really connected the dots of how close that was. But I was grateful, and I remembered 20 years later, and I remember today, and it is everything. And one of the things that I share, there have been a number of people in my life, and I think there are a number of people in each of our lives that have conversations sometimes that aren't maybe as clearly in need as this one. I think she was just being a good friend at the time. I think she was just saying, hey, you're struggling. I'm here. I'm going to connect with you and care for you. I don't think she understood the depth of where I was at. How could she have? And I think that we have these moments in our life where we affect people and we don't even know what we're doing. I mean, the reason my company started is because I was recommended kindly to a podcast by a karate teacher one night. That was the genesis of my company, which started less than a year later because of a kindness of suggesting I listen to a podcast. Mm-hmm. We don't know what actions we take that will become the inflection points in other people's lives.
Well, that's a big message right there, I would say. In the world today, people need to think very carefully about the words that they use, because words are not necessarily throwaway. You can't unsay something, but when you're kind, when you take that time out to actually see your fellow man or woman in the moment, you don't know, you could be saving somebody's life. So thank you for sharing that. I know you've mentioned earlier on that there was a second attempt 11 years ago. And if you're able to, it would be really useful for us to hear what led you to that point and what took you what saved you? What gave us that opportunity to be able to learn from you today?
In some ways, this is the harder one for me because it's the one I was more convinced should have happened at the time. It's also the one I'm incredibly grateful did not. I had been going through my life, my career, my journey, and growing and moving forward and learning, but never fulfilled, never feeling like I really fit in, feeling like I was meant for something, but I wasn't really accomplishing anything. And that's in contrast to what the external view probably would have been, because I had moved through escalating levels of leadership and I had been successful in sales. I'd been successful leading other people. I look back now and also see that a lot of it was ego driven, and I was frankly not the leader that I would hope to be, but I'd had a decent amount of external success, and by sheer force of will had moved forward. I'd moved from company to company, and in doing that, I was just looking. I was looking for where I fit. I also had been married at that point for about a little over 10 years. And as I look back, I was not the guy that I wanted to be. I was not the guy that I'd be proud to be now. I wasn't doing anything that was horrific. There was no abuse. There was no, it's not like, nothing like that. I don't, I have plenty of sins to atone for. Those aren't among them.
Would it be true to say that you had low self-esteem, or the events that had
for sure. A
taken
lot
over?
of lot of insecurity, a lot of feeling like I wasn't doing what I was meant to do in the world, but not knowing what it was, that resurgence of feeling unprepared and lost, and feeling like I was failing in my marriage. And the reason I paint the background is because for most people, when they share about their attempts, they're able to point to the inciting incident, but they don't necessarily look to what built to that. And I say inciting incident because there's in most things we do in life, there's a thing that pushes us over the edge. There's a thing that pushes us that final step of the way. And generally, it really is the straw and the camel. For me, the camel had been getting a bunch of stuff put on it for a long period of time, maybe through most of my life. But I look back now and I see that it was my own insecurity. It was my lack of finding what I was meant to do. It was my frustration at not fitting in. It was my intensity. It was my ego. It was all of those things. And ego covers insecurity. So absolutely, it was all of those things. The inciting incident was the night that my wife said she was leaving. And I look back and I say, rightfully so. I mean, not because I was a horrible person, but because we had a tough relationship, and I was so mired in insecurity that I had some anger issues, like some yelling, like I just wasn't as supportive as I could be. I wasn't providing as balanced of a relationship as I would like, or as mature of a relationship as I would like. And some of that's because I was pretty young, right? I mean, it was more because I was immature in a lot of ways and didn't realize that I was leading significant teams and companies but I didn't realize that I hadn't gained the maturity of leadership. I hadn't gained the seasoning of being the adult that I now would want to be and reflect what I want to reflect in the world. And so when that happened, it was like something just snapped. It was like the camel's back broke. It was like the dam let all the water out. And I was like, I can't do this, because my identity at that point was tied up in taking care of my family and making every sacrifice in my life to make sure that my family was taken care of, and making every sacrifice in my life to work 110 hours a week, to do whatever I had to do, no matter what, to make sure that everybody was taken care of. And I certainly hadn't learned about taking care of me at that point. I hadn't learned about the importance of my own growth at that point. I'd been fortunate to learn some things and to grow in some ways, but it wasn't in relational ways. It wasn't in character ways that I look at now as after I would like to describe it as I've been rebuilt but I was in a bad spot. I was in a lot of pain, and I was a doer, so I could do all kinds of stuff. Man, I could impress the heck out of people. I had recently had a major head injury. I'd thrown a bowling ball into my head, for those who want that story, but I almost died from that. But which is the quirkiest thing you'll ever hear, right? Who dies when they go bowling? And it was close to me. But I'd had that, and so that I'm sure was playing in. I had concussions and everything else that played in, and I was utterly hopeless. I was utterly lost. And there was another factor there. I mentioned that my identity was tied up in taking care of my family. My son was young at the time, and everything in my world was take care of my family. So in that moment, without taking a pause, as I would encourage people today to employ an interrupt, take a breath, and let your brain engage. I was not in a spot where I was doing that. And so in that moment, somewhere in my head, it fused very clearly together that, well, you have $1 million life insurance policy. And if you're not going to have a family, they should have $1 million, because that will make their life. We were struggling financially as well. We had all the pressures of that $1 million will make, if they're not going to be with you, it'll make everything right. And so I made a clear decision of what I was going to do. And it was not in question. It was not in doubt. I was 100% certain of what I was going to do.
Could I challenge you there?
Yeah.
How can I put this? Whilst you thought it through so much, as far as the question of the $1 million and what that could do for your life, for your family's life, was that you devaluing your life in some way?
Of course.
You'd reduced your presence down to $1 million.
I think it's even more than that. I think I reduced my presence down to a dollar figure. Yeah. I don't care what the dollar figure is. I think anytime we start saying my life is worth X dollars, we've lost the value of our impact in the world. Absolutely. And I look now, and I speak with people now, and I think of something, and I'll reflect it even at myself. I look at the people whose lives I've been honored to have an opportunity to engage with. I look at this conversation, which never could have happened had I done that. This conversation alone has an opportunity to be worth more than what $1 million could ever replace. And that's one conversation out of thousands that I've had.
And that's my point. That's my point, Dan, because at that point, you were putting dollars on your presence, whereas your family over the years have put, that there isn't a figure that they could put on you that would actually equate to the whole of impact that you have on them and on the world.
Yep, I agree. And at that point, it wasn't so much. What I would say though is that it wasn't so much that I was purely putting a dollar figure on it. It was more of, I had determined in my mind, in my broken mind that was not seeing it all clearly, that was lost in the darkness, that my presence was no longer a factor, that I wouldn't have a presence. Now, seeing with perspective and looking back, I can tell you that's ridiculous. That I would be there, that we would have a relationship, that I would matter to my son, that whatever that is, even if it had taken years to heal, and years to reconnect with my son, that I would have had an impact there. But in that moment, I had convinced myself, and we convince ourselves of a lot of lies in that moment. Yeah. We listen to the voice in our head, which now I've pulled out and separately named so that I can yell at it. We listen to the voices in our head, and we believe their lies in that moment because we have no perspective. We've lost sight of the fact that there is light in the darkness.
And it's so important. Your words today are so powerful and important, and I'm so grateful to you for sharing with us, because having been through it, having been so broken, so unable to actually perceive, that you have, come out today to tell us how it felt for you. And I'm just going to say thank you again at the moment, Dan, but I know there's more of the story. How did you come back from the edge on that point?
So I think, even touching on what you said a moment ago, when we are mentally healthy, when we are focused differently, we tend to look outward and upward. That's the point of health. When we struggle, whether it be with anxiety and depression or real strong thoughts of suicide, however that gets there, we tend to focus inward and downward, and the world narrows and narrows. And instead of seeing a wide array of light, it gets narrow and narrower and narrower. In fact, it's a lot like, in my experience, having a concussion, because the vision narrows and narrows down to a point of light. And then that point of light, when we feel like that, we've lost that anchor, that point of light. It's when we lose the last shred of hope. And so I look at part of my mission in the world to help provide at least a point of light, at least some anchor to as many people as possible. For me that day, after deciding what I was going to do, I was obviously super upset. But I went to my son and I said goodbye. And he didn't know what that meant. But I went to him and I hugged him and I said goodbye. And I got in my car and I took the chip out of my phone and I left. And I had no intention of ever coming back anywhere. And I'm grateful I did, but I drove around for a while trying to find the best spot, trying to find a spot where I could sit for a few minutes, where no one would see me, where it'd be a while before anyone found me. And taking the chip out of my phone was important in two ways. One, because I didn't want to be found, and it was real. And second, because I'm super social, and it meant that I was done. I was done with the conversations. I was done with the discussion. I didn't want to have another conversation ever again. And again, I look back and I see, wow, how much I was missing. But in that moment, I was so locked in. And my story is different than many at this point, because I was entirely convinced that I was doing the right thing. And it wasn't like earlier in my life. It wasn't just out of pain. It was now out of duty. I actually felt that I had a responsibility to do this, that if I didn't, that I was letting my family down, that if they weren't going to have me, that they at least needed to have freedom and hope and the ability to really move on. And I believed to my core that it was the right thing to do. And I got there, and I said earlier that it comes back to a train. And I sat there looking at the tracks and knowing that a train was coming. I'd looked up the schedules. I knew when trains were coming. And a train started coming. And I discovered something about myself that surprised me. To that point in my life, every single time I'd ever hit something that I felt was a responsibility, that was a duty, that was my obligation, I had stepped up and done it. Period. Full stop. Never had missed it. Not that I'd never missed a task or turning in a paper, but something that mattered, I had never, ever missed. And as I got ready to take my final steps, if you will. I couldn't do it. I tried. And I looked, man, I was so mad. I was mad for days after. I was mad for weeks after, because I felt like I'd failed my family. I felt like I had failed the world because I didn't fulfill the one big responsibility that I had in front of me.
Right, Dan, let's take a break now.
When I first started coming into this, I knew where I was going, but from here to here was just like a big empty sort of path. And Dan has sort of filled in like, well, if you want to get there, let's go ahead and trace the steps.
I feel like at the end of the day, I get a lot more done. Just the organizational skills that he brings to the table is amazing.
I found that Dan very much met me where I was at.
If you want to see growth, strategic thinking is the way to do it. We went from that garage to a 14,000 square foot facility. Last year we did $1 million in revenue. The single thing, if I had to pick out one thing, was that talk with Dan.
I could work with someone that actually knows how this works and is willing to take the time and energy to apply it to my field and teach it to me and tailor it to what I do.
If you don't have a mentor right now that you look to for your business, I think Dan is the perfect one for my business. He's been amazing.
Okay, Dan, that is such a powerful story that you have there. And I'd like to thank you again for sharing it. But what I want to know is, how did you take yourself out of that anger and frustration you felt over the next few days? And what happened next? You know, what happened next to take you to the Dan we all know and love today?
I appreciate the know and love part. I don't know if I'll accept the all, but we'll go from there. As I look back to that day, I think that when I put the chip back on my phone, I felt an immense amount of shame. And it's interesting because I found this in others who haven't, in their mind, succeeded in their attempt. In fact, I think they succeeded in surviving. And that's how I would claim it now. But on that day, I felt shame at having failed. I felt shame at not having done it. And then when I put the chip back in my phone, I discovered that like half the town had been looking for me, that everybody on my bowling league, that my wife had everybody out looking for me, the police. And I was confused because in my mind, like, why did it matter? Right. And there was a lot of anger directed toward me. This was 11, 12 years ago, I think, or 11 years ago now. So I think there was probably less understanding of what was going on than there may be a little bit in the world today. There was also a connection from others to say, hey, like, this isn't okay. I think it's worth noting that me doing this didn't make anything better in my relationship with my wife. And I say that because sometimes people will do it saying, well, if I do this, it'll just, and then it doesn't happen. Well, now why aren't things all better? It did not. In fact, I think it damaged it further because it felt like a further breach of trust. Like, well, wait a minute, you can't handle like this difficult situation we're in. So you're just throwing your hands up and so it created some frustration there. I was angry with myself. I was ashamed of myself. And for the first few weeks, and especially the first few days, no matter how many times people would say, I'm grateful you're here. I'm happy you're here. I'm glad that you didn't do that. And they meant it. Like they were like, I'm honored by it as I look back. I brushed it off because I was just pissed. I was just really upset. I was really angry at myself because I believed, even in that moment, I believed that it was a right thing to do, but I had faced the fact that even if I believed it was 100% the right thing to do, I could never do it. Because I've never believed something was so right and not been able to do it. And I knew I would never believe that it was that right again. So I knew I couldn't. And so I dealt with all of those emotions, and that was really hard. What I came to understand over weeks and months was that I wasn't seeing a great perspective, was that, hey, this was a reaction at a moment of loss. And it was I don't want to say inappropriate, but it was a poor response to grief. It was a poor response to situations. And that by the time I got maybe a year later, I was able to say the words, "I'm glad it didn't work." But it took a year. It didn't take a minute.
Mm-hmm.
And for some people, when it doesn't happen, it takes a minute. But for some people, it takes a long time, and they live with that in a sense of shame. And I think it's important as a society. I think it's important as a group of supporters that we recognize that, because we're very quick to encourage people that we're glad they're there for a day or two when we remember and when it's fresh. But 6 months later, those conversations are few and far between, and you're left to sort it out on your own.
I understand that.
And I'm a huge fan of counseling and therapy. I did not at that point. I've dealt with therapists and so forth since then, and I'm incredibly grateful for that opportunity. But I didn't have access to that at the time, and I think that made it a lot harder. I would encourage people to talk to someone who actually knows what they're talking about in these areas and can help and guide them through a bit. For me, I was left to sort it out on my own, and left in the mire that I knew that I wouldn't attempt again, that I couldn't, but left in feeling inadequate. And it cost me at work. It cost me in other areas. What I did come to, and I think this is important, is that I needed to rebuild myself. I recognized, and some of this is me with the wisdom of looking back. Some of it was pieces I figured out during, but all of it is reflected in the process that happened, which is that I recognized if I'd gotten to that spot, that there's something foundationally that wasn't right in my world.
Absolutely.
That didn't mean that I wasn't right. I want to clarify that. That didn't mean that I wasn't right, that I didn't have value, that everything was wrong with me, that didn't mean that nobody loved me or cared about me it didn't mean any of those things. But it meant that at some spot in the foundation of my life, in the foundation of my core personal beliefs, there was something that wasn't right. Because if it was, that's not how I would have responded. I would not have gotten to that spot. And so I recognized I needed to pull everything apart about my own belief system, my own core values, my own pieces, and keep what was good, root out the others, and rebuild.
And that takes a lot of strength.
And a lot of time.
And a lot of time, yes. And effort.
It does. And it also takes a lot of working through most people around you having no understanding of how hard it is, what's going on, how much pain is involved. But I will say this, that in the end of the day, there's nothing in my life that has made my life move more forward than being willing to do that, than being willing to step into the humility and the understanding that I needed to work on me. That to be able to do anything I'm meant to do in the world, I needed to work on me.
Would that be your main piece of advice that you would give to somebody who feels as broken and as lost as you were at that time? To take the time.
That would be one of them. I think the first two pieces of advice I would give are reach out to somebody, and don't assume that they don't care. I had this thing where, and this was pointed out to me in a therapy session that I'm grateful for to this moment, that I had a tendency to want to make people prove to me that they cared instead of honoring them and accepting that they cared and that they meant what they said. And so in my mind, if people couldn't make it through like the 5 gates of proof to hang in there and prove that they cared in every possible way, that I wouldn't really let them in. I wouldn't really listen, or I wouldn't really trust it. And so I would say one of the first would be reach out and accept what is there rather than judging it as not valid.
Yes.
I think the second would be to connect with, think back to your life and think when you felt like something was never going to end and it felt hopeless as an individual incident, not as your overall life. And then 6 months later at that same situation, or 6 years later at that same situation, and ask if it was still true? And the answer, 99.99% of the cases, is it wasn't. And draw that analogy to your whole life, that when you feel it's hopeless 6 months or 6 years later, that's not going to be true. That we don't have the perspective of the future, that it's easy to say hindsight is 2020, foresight is not. But what we can know is that there is always light through the darkness, always.
Tell me how you got from that point to your current position, your businesses today, your successes. Tell us about that.
So the rebuilding,
The rebuilding,
the rebuilding. We remodel buildings. I was remodeling me, and it was, as we said, it was hard. One of the first things I had to figure out is, why was it, though I knew that my heart was good, and I cared about people, I passionately cared about people, but when I expressed it, it didn't come out the right way. Like it didn't. When I was leading teams, I led with intensity and fierceness and sheer force of will, but not with connection, even though my heart was for them, and I was doing it because I wanted to help them and I cared about them. And there were people who fit within my favored leadership style, and therefore we had a great connection, and I'm still connected to some of them today. But those who were outside of that, I didn't yet know how to move between leadership styles and connect with them. And I burned a lot of those bridges because I came across with an ego the size of a hotel. And that wasn't intentional. That wasn't really how I felt internally, but that was the reflection. And as I began to recognize, that was born out of this insecurity. It was born out of these doubts and these concerns. It was born out of me not feeling enough, me not feeling what I knew what my purpose was. And it was also born out of me not having some skills that I needed. So I set about for the next 10 years learning everything that I could about me. But the first core thing that I did is say, I'm not all that. Like, this broke me. It broke me to the spot to where anything that had been ego before was gone, like gone, blown away, but with dynamite. And so now I had a new form of insecurity and that I had to overcome. And thankfully it was one that was a little easier, and some healing helped to overcome it. But now I had this form of insecurity that wasn't covered by arrogance. It was just bare insecurity. It was I doubted everything I did. I doubted, was it right? Was that okay? I looked for validation everywhere. So instead of looking for validation nowhere, I looked for validation everywhere. And that wasn't great, but it gave me this foundation now to start saying, I need to learn. I need to get better. I need to grow. I need to move forward. I need to be the person I want to be. And maybe most importantly, I need to find my purpose. And it took me a number of years to do that. I can tell you that martial arts has played a huge role in that. My son and I have been doing martial arts together. My son has played a huge role in that. My son is my world. Anybody who knows me well knows my son is my world. And I spend as much time as possible with him. And we started doing martial arts because I was traveling 100 nights a year. And I said, I want to make sure no matter what, I've got an anchor in place. And so we started Taekwondo together, and we had to go to 2 classes a week. And I made a commitment with him that until we got our black belts, which was going to take 4 years, that we would never, ever miss a class in the week that it was supposed to be. And we actually went 5 years before we missed our first class. And no matter what, I made that a priority. So what did I do? It's what I said earlier. I started looking outward and upward rather than inward and downward. So even though I was working on me, I was doing it by looking outward and upward. I was living forward. I had spent much of my life living in my past and wishing for a fantasy future rather than living in the present and working for a real future. And I'd been doing the work. I'd been churning the wheel, the hamster wheel of life, if you will, but I hadn't been present. And I think getting to a spot where I could be present and where I could be in this moment and have a clear vision for the future and work toward that rather than thinking of it as some fantasy I wish I had while I lived in the dreams of the past, mattered a great deal. And it let me, combined with looking outward and upward, take very significant steps forward until I figured out where I needed to go. And where I needed to go was to stop chasing meaning elsewhere and do what I was meant to do in the world. And that actually brings us to that conversation with my karate teacher. I was leading a team and I had learned a lot, and I was in a much better place than I'd been. I still wasn't, I'm learning as a leader every day. I believe passionately that we either get better or worse every day. And if we think that we're sitting still, that we're sliding backwards. So I've committed to never losing a day. So I was getting better. And I was leading this team and I went to go teach a meeting. And I remember I was really upset. Like, I decided I don't want to lead this meeting. Well, why don't I? Because I just feel empty. I'm like, I have nothing to give. I reached in and I had nothing to give. It was really confusing to me, and I didn't understand why. Not coincidentally, because I don't believe in coincidences. I've seen them, but I don't believe in them. And so at karate, within a week, Master Terry comes up to me and he says, hey, just after class, he said, hey, I encountered this podcast I think you'd like. I was like, cool, what's a podcast? And I didn't really know. And it was Tim Ferriss, who I really have appreciated his podcast. I've listened to a couple thousand hours of it. And I went home and I listened. And within just a few days, I was listening to 10 hours a day of it. I couldn't get enough. And what I realized very quickly was that I had stopped feeding into me, so I had nothing to feed into anyone else. And that was the first time that anchored so strong in me. And that was the start of everything changing for me. That moment was everything.
That's powerful. That realization, because I know these days we spend a lot of time talking about me time and self-love, and investing in ourselves, but finding the balance is key, really, isn't it?
It is. And I was working 100 hours a week and it was all giving. I was coming home and it was all giving. And I had been a learner. I believe leaders are learner, but I had lost track of it because I was just pouring out so much. And eventually I reached in and there was, we say you can't pour from an empty cup. I had an empty cup. I had licked the bottom to get every last drop out. Like there was nothing there. I think I had the Q-tip swab trying to find something, and it was as empty as it could be. And I finally recognized it was empty, but I didn't get it. And then this suggestion, I go listen, and it's like the gates open. And that is really, I like to say that people tend to have about 8 inflection points in their life on average. And that, when I was suggested to listen to that podcast, is one of the 8 inflection points of my life. And I truly honor Master Terry for that. It was the most innocuous conversation he and I have probably had in the 7 years that we've been there. He's taught me so many different things. That was the one that there's no possible way he could have known changed my life and allowed me to start my company and be where I am today. And everything cascaded forward from that moment.
Thank you, Dan. Hold that thought for a minute for me. This has been so interesting, Dan. You've been through so much in your life, and you've worked your way through and gone through the rebuilding process. And so I'd like to ask you, on behalf of our friends here, what are the good things that have come from this? What are the positives in your life today?
Everything. And I really believe that. I believe that even the challenges, even the struggles, everything is good. And there are 2 reasons for that. One, because it's all things that wouldn't have existed had I made a different choice. And the fact that I'm here to experience them, to engage with them, that makes them all good. And on a more broad basis, what is good is that I am here to fulfill the purpose that I have in the world. That I was being prepared for many years to fulfill that purpose, and now I'm able to do that. I define success as living the purpose that you were meant for every day. And I'm honored to be doing that. I'm honored to have an opportunity to do that. There's so much good in my life. I believe in general that 90% of what happens in life is how we respond to things, and only 10% is what actually happens. I believe that 90% on a broad basis of the actual physical number of things in our life, that at least 90% of them are good and 10% are struggle. And I have chosen to not allow the 10 to control the 90. So as I came forward and I was inspired to start my company, I say inspired because as I started feeding in, I realized, I've got to either do it or admit that I'm not going to do it. In other words, I said from earlier on that I felt like I was meant for something. Now was the time. I'd been prepared. I'd been moved along. And when my bosses flew in and offered me my third promotion in 5 years, this was 5 years ago or 4 years ago now, I looked at them and I said, what would it look like if I declined? And I stepped off the cliff to start my company and build the airplane on the way down because I had no other income in the household, nothing else going on. And that was scary, exciting, thrilling, but I don't back away from that type of a decision. I'm going to jump. I knew I either had to do it or admit that I wasn't going to, and I have zero admit that I'm not going to in me, not even 1% of it. So I was in, and I'm so thankful that I have. It's opened up the opportunity for me to really help people who felt like I did, who felt overlooked and underserved, who felt unprepared for life. It's allowed me to work with groups like women entrepreneurs and creatives and people in the LGBTQ community, and to help provide them the tools that they need to truly achieve their dreams. In doing that, I've had an opportunity to travel throughout Southeast Asia with a group called Freedom Summit Global and speak all over the world last year. I've had an opportunity to engage with thousands of connections, and people say you can't talk to thousands of people. Wrong. Yes, I can. And I do. I meet 2 or 3 or 4 new people every single week and have real conversations with them, not drive-bys. And I have just an incredible wealth of people and amazement from around the world that it's just awesome. I've been able to work with wonderful clients and help them transform their businesses and achieve their dreams, to work with the podcast that we have and hear stories all over the world, including yours, which is a pretty amazing story. And now as I'm looking forward, I look forward to accomplishing our mission. I built a team. My team, oh man, I could rave about my team forever. My team currently of 10, soon to be of 20 people who just have a heart for the world and a heart for our mission and are eager to serve and to help and to do wonderful things. I could brag on each of them for sure. And to work with a group of people doing the work that you're meant to do in the world every day and living what truly is my dream. I couldn't ask for more.
Got a question. One last question, I promise you. Will you ever stop?
I sure hope not. I'll say this. I will stop when I'm done. And the mission,
will you ever be done?
The mission to inspire generational change doesn't sound like it's going to finish anytime soon.
That's what I wanted to hear.
That's the thing, right? And even if it did, I'd be on to what's the next generational change. I train people on how to find their North Star. And one of the things that I remind them is that life is 0% about a destination, and it is all about the process. It's all about the journey.
Thank you, Dan. Now I want to give the audience a chance to get to know you. So, a few questions.
Bring it.
Do you rinse your toothbrush when you've put toothpaste on it?
Yes, I do. And I don't understand the people who don't.
Carrots or celery?
Carrots, period. Celery salt, I can do like on a hot dog, but other than that, it's all carrot.
Okay, chicken or beef? I know you're a big grill man, so that's quite a question.
I am. I like both. If it's steak or burgers, though, it's got to be well done, which is going to alienate like half of your audience, but that's okay.
Thank you, Dan. You've been brilliant. And we are at the end of another story. I hope you've enjoyed this. I think the pertinent point here is that Dan has been through some really dark moments in life, but found the light. He found his North Star. He's walking towards it. As he says, he'll never be done. He'll never be done creating. He'll never be done making the most of the life that he has and helping others, making changes in this world. When we listen to each other, when we hear these stories, the purpose is for us to be able to learn from others' experiences and know that we're not alone. Because this has been Jacqui and Friends. We are your friends and we're here to listen. If you have any comments for Dan, please put them in the comment boxes below and I'll get you in contact with him. His contact details were featured earlier on in the show, and he's always happy to hear from you. So on that note, thank you and see you next week. And there we have it, another empowering episode of Survival Stories. If you heard something today that resonated with you, please reach out at jacquiandfriends.com and download our free PDF. Don't forget to head over to iTunes and leave a 5-star review and rating. And whilst you're online, why not join our community of warriors on Facebook at Survival with Jacqui. Look forward to seeing you there.